Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for coming out to listen to me, and in particular to thank Andra, Kaliaset, and Anita for giving me this opportunity and for all the work that they put into making this great colloquium series possible. I also wanted to thank Josh, whose help with the research for this project has been really indispensable. And I also wanted to start with a warning. This research is at its very earliest stages. I've been really grateful for the opportunity to begin the research and theorization of this new topic over the past few months, but it's still at a very early point in development, so I'm very eager and grateful for any comments during the question and answers. I'm going to talk today primarily about African American responses to immigration restriction, and more specifically deportation, during the period from 1919 to 1939. As Andra mentioned, my previous work is on deportation during the 1920s and focuses on the creation of the modern deportation state. As I was working on it, I kept finding myself curious about responses to this growing system for removal. In particular, I kept finding myself frustrated with the pervasive and uncomplicated references to the perspectives of the quote-unquote native-born regarding immigration. What I found is that for the most part, discussions about deportation and nativist sentiment implicitly code native-born as white, and in the process, erase American-born people of color from the conversation. It seems clear that in the complex debates over racialized immigration restrictions, deportation, and citizenship rights during the early 20th century, Black Americans had a unique perspective, but in general, this perspective has gone largely unexplored. There's been a tendency of historians to treat immigration and Black studies as distinct fields and not to recognize the points at which they overlap as fields of inquiry. And in general, this has been particularly true of history as a field. There's been more research on this in fields like sociology, but historians have been kind of slow to catch up and recognize these trends historically. Much of what has been written on the subject has been reduced a much more complex set of relationship and discourses to the single theme of economic competition. While there has undoubtedly been a pervasive strain of economic anxiety reaching from the 1800s to the present, underpinned by the reality that the structure of white supremacy in America has facilitated the economic advancement of various groups of newcomers, often at the direct expense of African Americans, this is not the entire story. Instead, I have found, responses throughout the early 20th century reflected a wide range of approaches to the question of deportation. In many cases, Black leaders and intellectuals did express concerns about the economic impact of migrants, and conflicts developed between African Americans and immigrants in multi-ethnic urban neighborhoods, at the factory gates, and in the fields at harvest times. However, these sentiments were often tempered by warnings against immigration restrictions, primarily or solely on the basis of nationality or race, which many warned would provide a dangerous precedent for discriminatory legislation. As I begin to work through the African American press coverage and writings on the subject, I would argue that African Americans increasingly began to understand deportation as a multifaceted tool for the maintenance of white supremacy. In their formulations, this occurred not only through the solidification of new and racialized foreign identities, but also, fundamentally, as a form of anti-Blackness. The highlighting of accounts of Black deportees was only the most obvious way that Black Americans came to understand deportation as part of the flexible anti-Black strategies of the white supremacist order. Compared to other publications, African American newspapers at the time paid a disproportionate amount of attention to deportations from other parts of the world, including to the United States, and often discussed how these removals were designed at maintaining the global color line and undermining the free right of Blacks to travel. At the same time, they also stressed the various ways that the selection of which deportable immigrants would actually get removed was significantly shaped by their interactions with African Americans. In short, in spite of the oversimplification in the existing literature, African Americans did not merely position themselves in relation to immigrants as either economic competitors or fellow oppressed people. They created a complex and multifaceted discourse, which reflected a deep understanding of how deportation served to enforce anti-Black racial politics in America. In many ways, this project aims to push back at what I see as the striking erasure of Blackness from conversations about immigration policy, both in terms of the Black immigrant bodies actually policed under the modern immigration regime, and in terms of the African American voices and perspectives on immigration. On the first point, there has been a notable lack of attention to the stories of Black immigrants within immigration history as a field. And I should pause here and briefly explain what I mean by Black immigrants. I mean individuals who the US immigration authorities classified as quote unquote African, Black, who came largely from the Caribbean during this period, although also in smaller numbers from Africa, Canada, and other parts of Latin America. So this just gives you a sense of some of the places that they're coming from. As Ira Reid, the Atlanta University professor who wrote the first book on Black immigrants in 1939, explained, Africans, Black is the coverall term employed by the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization to cloak with racial identification all persons of Negro extraction admitted to or departing from the United States. It is a conjure word that metamorphoses persons who, prior to embarking for the United States, may have been known as colored, mulatto, or Black, or who had not been grouped by race or color. End quote. Just to give you a sense of scale, during the period from 1899 to 1937, roughly 150,000 immigrants classed as Black were admitted to the US, along with an unknown number of additional migrants who arrived without authorization. Over recent decades, immigration historians have increasingly moved away from their overwhelming focus on white European migrants and explored various aspects of Asian and Latin American migration. But there has continued to be a significant lack of attention to both African and Afro-Caribbean immigrants, particularly in discussions of immigration policy and deportation. As Violet Johnson explained in her 2006 book on West Indian immigrants in Boston, quote, Black foreigners have remained on the periphery of American immigration historiography. Their marginalization is clearly reflected in general histories of multicultural or ethnic America, which completely ignore or give only the scantest attention to their experiences. While much of the scholarship on early 20th century immigration has erased the presence of Black immigrants, it is clear from examining the African American press and the writings of African American leaders that they were highly attuned to the realities of Black immigration. At the same time, African Americans have also been erased from the historical debates over immigration policy. This erasure from the research and scholarship on immigration also echoes the actual exclusion of Black individuals both from the nation and the conversation. As legal scholar Bail Ong Hing explains, quote, US immigration policies send messages of exclusion to many African Americans. The message is not only one of physical exclusion from the country, but exclusion from deliberations on matters that appear to affect their community. While African Americans throughout the early 20th century were kept out of the policy-making chambers of federal legislation, they did write and engage with questions of immigration restriction, and their absence from the scholarship on the subject only furthers their marginalization within the discourse. Before I get too deeply into this discussion, I want to clarify exactly what I mean by deportation, because as this term gained prominence in the post-World War I period, it was often employed in a variety of different ways. Deportation in the legal sense refers to the specific process of removing a foreign-born resident from the nation under official government proceeding. And as you can see from this is something that was expanding vastly over the course of the early 20th century, from only a couple of hundred a year at the turn of the century to over 16,000 by the start of the Depression. Deportation, but however, this term has been also used interchangeably with a variety of forms of forced, pressured, or otherwise coercive removals, including repatriation without formal government proceedings, vigilante roundups, or other forms of mass expulsion, often based on a particular social or racial identity. In the particular context I'm talking about, deportation was often used as the catch-all term for a variety of distinctive processes of removal. Since the 19th century, deportation had been utilized as another term for repatriation to Africa or colonization schemes about moving massive numbers of Black Americans to Africa. The term was also increasingly used in the Black press to describe the extra-legal local purges that state and local governments engaged in during the Great Migration North, where individuals and officials often rounded up African American migrants and deported them back to the South, or in reality, often merely just over the town, county, or state line in order to abdicate responsibility for their welfare and to expel them from the local white community. Therefore, while I will try to be precise with what processes I'm talking about, it is important to note that the rise of the formal bureaucratic deportation regime that you're seeing here, under the auspices of the Immigration Bureau itself, coexisted with a complex array of forms of forced migration that were called deportation. I think, however, though, it's also important to discuss this as more than just semantics, that the African American press throughout this period used this terminology to encompass these three distinctive historical phenomena. At root, they identified each of these processes as being about the control of black bodies through coercive mobility. Each of these forms of deportation, whether or not they fit the legal definition, served as tools for the maintenance of white supremacy through removing black individuals or communities from existence in particular spaces. Each demonstrated that controlling migration and mobility, alongside other forms of state violence, would continue to be a critical strategy of the nation in its repression of the black population, both native and foreign-born. Alongside discussions of international deportations, black writers identified a growing effort to deport black workers in between states, particularly in the aftermath of the First Great Migration, when unprecedented numbers of African Americans came to northern localities. These localities often met migrating African Americans with clear hostility and engaged in a variety of forms of extralegal deportations. There were hundreds of articles in the black press throughout this period about these deportations, such as the case of Beaver, Pennsylvania, in which the press described how county authorities, quote unquote, kidnapped 45 colored men and women on a dark and rainy night, loaded them on rickety trucks, and dumped them on a desolate roadway. At the same time, African Americans often directly correlated back to Africa deportation schemes with other forms of deportation. After Senator Bilbo's 1939 statement arguing for deportation of the African American population, a number of editorialists responded. One Massachusetts man insisted, if he wants to help America get rid of some of her liability, let him bundle up the undesirable aliens of all the races and deport them. If he did that, I think he would be spending his time more profitably than by trying to persuade the most loyal and faithful group in the United States, the colored Americans. I have chosen to hone in on this period starting at the end of the First World War and extending to the American entry into World War II because this period was marked by a particular set of immigration trends, racial politics, and extensive debates over belonging in American society. However, it is important to know that immigration restriction in the modern form was still quite new. While migration had been controlled both through exclusion and deportation since the colonial period, immigration control under formal bureaucratic control only began in the 1870s and 1880s with the passage of the first federal legislation. Since its very inception, such legislation was racially based, beginning with the Page Act in 1875, which targeted contract laborers and prostitutes, particularly from Asia, and then solidified in the first racially based form of entry with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Following this period, federal legislation grew quickly, in large part in response to the unprecedented migration of the period from the 1880s up to 1920, in which an estimated 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Their arrival was marked by tension not only because of their sheer numbers, but also because of concerns over their distinctive ethnic backgrounds and the fear that they would be less likely to assimilate into American culture. The new immigrants, as they came to be known, were largely from Southern and Eastern European, were heavily Catholic and Jewish, rarely spoke English, and were generally impoverished. The less frequently discussed reality of the period is that there was also a small but significant increase in immigration from nations of the Western Hemisphere, including Mexico and the British West Indies. Relying on racialized stereotypes, morality scares, anti-radicalism, and pseudo-scientific arguments, the rising tide of nativism found supporters in Congress, and a series of restrictive immigration laws were passed over the course of these decades, culminating in the Quota Acts of the 1920s. For the sake of time, I won't talk about those too much, but after Chinese exclusion, you get exclusion on the basis of things like disease, polygamy, people who are likely to become a public charge, which was actually the most commonly used form of deportation after a certain period, for mental feeble-mindedness and imbecility, as they were called. After great debate and several earlier failures, in 1917, Congress also instituted a literacy test requirement for immigrants entering the country. The most important shift of the period, however, was the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the subsequent Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924, which instituted a permanent system of national origins quotas, which would form the basis of modern immigration policy until its repeal in the 1960s. Furthermore, the acts further solidified exclusion from Asian nations, with the exception of the Philippines, which was in a unique status as a colonial territory of the United States. The Quota Acts were, as many scholars have noted, blatantly racist and designed to preserve particular ethnic heritage in the United States. Throughout this period, African American leaders were highly attuned to these shifts and debated their impact on the position of Black Americans. In the post-Civil War period, Frederick Douglass, while concerned about the impact of immigration on the position of newly freed African Americans in society, expressed concern about the racial ramifications of supporting nativist movements. Douglass, along with other Black leaders, was critical of the Chinese Exclusion Act and asserted that the Chinese should not be singled out for different treatment from other immigrants. For many African Americans, their perception of immigrants was shaped by the fact that these groups quickly adopted anti-Black prejudices after their arrival and contributed to the marginalization of Black Americans. There was also, on occasion, hostility rooted in the fact that many of these newcomers received greater consideration from the government than African Americans did as American citizens, in no small part because they had the backing of a foreign government who advocated for their position in the U.S. For Booker T. Washington, the question of immigration was critical to the construction of his philosophy about the place of the African American, particularly in the American South. His famous address in Atlanta contained a critical discussion of immigration, warning whites who might be tempted to replace Black workers with foreigners that immigrants would lack the loyalty and indeed the passivity which made African Americans such desirable laborers. Quote unquote, those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits, he explained, were not the solution. Instead, by casting down their buckets among the existing population of familiar Black laborers, the South would benefit from what he called, quote, the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful people that the world has ever seen. Over the course of his career, he often returned to this trope, and addressing the fears of economic competition, used it as substantiation for his social philosophy of uplift and opportunity. However, although he on occasion joined in the denigration and stereotyping of Chinese laborers, he did speak out in 1905 against Chinese exclusion, arguing that they deserved a fair chance in America along with others. One rare instance in which Black leaders became actively involved in lobbying around immigration policy was in response to a series of proposed bans on Black immigration, which would have prohibited anyone of the African Black race, regardless of nationality, to be admitted. Oops. In 1915, a proposal to this effect initially passed in the Senate by a margin of 29 to 25, but after a frantic canvassing of House offices by the NAACP, which brought around this proposed statement, it was defeated in the House by an overwhelming majority of 252 to 75. When Senator Reed once again proposed amendments to exclude all natives of Africa and the West Indies in February of 1917, they were voted down fairly narrowly by margins of 37 to 32 for Africans and 36 to 28 for West Indians. This was also one of the only moments that Washington himself directly participated in pushing for a particular immigration policy, calling the proposal to exclude Black immigrants, quote, unnecessary, unjust, and unreasonable, and stating that it was a slap in the face for the African American community. Of course, given the venue, I would be remiss if I neglected James Weldon Johnson's own writings on the subject of immigration restriction. While he did not take up the subject at great length often, he did address it in a few editorials in the New York Age, as well as in his 1930 Black Manhattan, where he described the loss of status African Americans experienced after the arrival of immigrants. Referring to European immigration in the early and mid-1800s, Johnson explained, quote, the New York Negroes as a class were industrious and thrifty and were making economic gains. Then began the wave of foreign immigration, which continued to swell until, economically, it all but submerged them. Gradually but steadily, the Negro lost ground. It was only with the arrival of World War I, he went on to write, that there was once again hope for African Americans to regain status economically in relation to the foreign-born. As a result of the war, he explained, there was both significant outmigration of immigrants returning to fight for their home countries, but also an almost total pause in migration. Therefore, he explained, the only logical source of labor was Black workers from the South. He included that this was an instance where, quote, one man's ill is another's good. By the 1920s, while many African American leaders welcomed the Quota Acts and hoped that they would lead to a greater availability of work for domestic populations, some leaders were appalled at its impact on the freedom of Black migration from the Caribbean. As Du Bois wrote in The Crisis following the passage of the law, quote, the Nordic champions undoubtedly put one over on us in the recent immigration bill. as it was by the simple device of discriminating between self-governing and crown colonies in the British Empire, a device whose significance at the time escaped us, immigration to the United States from the West Indies has practically been barred. So in other words, he was saying that those from white settler states in the British Empire, such as Canada, remained exempt from quota laws, while those in crown colonies, including the predominantly black Caribbean colonies, would remain under the British quota, which would be controlled by the American consulate in London. Unsurprisingly, this led to a massive reduction in black Caribbean immigration, dropping to a mere fraction of its rate before the act. As David Hellwig, the most prolific writer on the subject of African American responses to immigration restriction, has concluded, Du Bois was one of the only black leaders to consistently oppose a restrictive immigration policy. And as he explains, even he ultimately hedged on his opposition. One of the major difficulties that Du Bois and other leaders had with supporting immigration restriction was its tremendous support by white supremacists, including the KKK, which pushed for its passage. Others argued that while they were eager for a reduction in economic competition, they were troubled by what Charles S. Johnson described as, quote, the political revolt against the melting pot, and the problematic racial politics of restrictionist arguments. After the Quota Acts were put into place, the next major shift in African American opinion on deportation came as a result of the Great Depression, and overwhelmingly the conversation shifted toward the question of deporting immigrants who were receiving public relief. While a number of black leaders, particularly within left-wing political movements, continued to critique deportations, especially as repressions of civil liberties, African American newspapers took a decisive shift towards preserving economic stability through nationalism. Many editorials claimed that countries such as France and England insisted in their law that all citizens wanting to work had positions before allowing any non-citizen a job, and suggested that the US should follow suit. One of the most critical developments of the period was the mass coercive repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexicans during the Great Depression. While estimates vary, scholars have determined that at least 400,000 Mexican immigrants and US citizens of Mexican descent were removed to Mexico, particularly in the first few years of the Depression. This process rarely happened through formal proceedings of deportation warrant, but often occurred under a great deal of pressure, if not outright coercion. The African American press was strikingly quiet about the subject, although occasional articles on the Mexican removals did reflect the racial stigma faced by Mexicans and Mexican Americans, despite their official legal categorization as white. Occasional articles did address the subject, but they were remarkably rare. In a 1929 article entitled "Jumping on the Mexicans," one writer argued that Mexican laborers had been imported for their lower wages, but after white Americans realized that their technical status as white under the law required them to permit them in equal public spaces, quote, the bulk of whites revolted. They addressed the problem, he explained, by a combined campaign of deporting as many Mexicans as possible, while also attempting to push the Mexican off on the Negroes in terms of legal classification. There were significantly more articles about the much smaller scale efforts to remove a large number of Afro-Caribbean workers, particularly from Florida, during the same Depression period. Many editorials reminded African American leaders not to blame conditions on black immigrants and instead encouraged them to take out citizenship papers and integrate themselves into American society as a guard against potential racially motivated action by the state. Starting in 1932, the black press discussed proposals by officials, particularly in Florida, to remove Bahamian laborers, including ones who had been recruited to work on white farms. They discussed the move to, quote-unquote, rid the Everglades of unnaturalized Bahamian islanders, and concluded that the first move will be to get the immigration authorities to rid all Negroes who have entered the country illegally and deport them. By 1935, articles stressed that this project had increased not only in real scope, but in rhetorical use to attack black immigrants more generally. In more general questions of deportation during the Depression period, the press dealt with the question of who had a right to welfare and came down, for the most part, in favor of reserving public funds only for citizens. A 1939 editorial in the Pittsburgh Courier entitled "No More Aliens Wanted" argued that with the unemployment rates of 12 to 14 million already within the country, there was no justification for letting in immigrants fleeing the war and dictatorships in Europe. While the author explained that, quote, with the plight of many of the people in Europe, we are of course sympathetic, but we believe America's duty is first of all to Americans. Before going on to inquire, Why not limit the number of jobs to immigrants in this country to the number of Americans which other countries are willing to accept and give jobs? Why must Uncle Sam always be Santa Claus? I want to draw your attention first here to the statement of one editorialist to the Chicago Defender in 1932, and then I'll switch over to only 9 months later, a series of letter write-ins from readers who held a highly distinct, and you may see eerily familiar to the present, position on deportation. In the first, you can see a passionate defense of the foreign-born as an ally to the Black community, and in the second, a strong threat of economic nationalism, demonstrating that, of course, African Americans were never represented by any single position or set of discourses on the question. I want to move now to a discussion of some of the major ways in which discourses around deportations in the Black press were unique, particularly in comparison to mainstream white publications of the era. In the rare instances where it has been discussed, Black critiques of immigration restriction have been explained on the basis of solidarity in a fairly limited sense, the claim that African Americans saw immigrants undergoing parallel forms of racial discrimination and identified with them. While a closer look at the Black press reveals that this was undoubtedly salient, there was also a deep strain of depicting deportation itself as a form of anti-Black policing. This comes through in three major ways. Firstly, writers emphasized the deportation of Black immigrants and particularly noted Black icons. Second, they constructed a framework for understanding the multi-directional nature of deportation, and in particular, the ways it was used by other nations to deport African Americans back to the US. Thirdly, they highlighted the ways in which immigrants of all races were deported from the US for transgressing racial boundaries by intermarrying with African Americans or advocating for Black rights. One of the clearest facts that emerges from a study of the African American press is that there was a heavy emphasis on deportations of Black immigrants from the US, which was not true during the corresponding period in most white periodicals. Often Black newspapers traced the stories of prominent Black immigrants who had become cultural icons not only within the Black immigrant community, but within the African American community as well, including athletes, actors, and musicians. The focus on their removals, alongside the more common and less sensationalized deportations of Black immigrants who were removed for criteria of poverty, crime, or immigration violations, built a clear depiction of the early deportation state as disproportionately targeting Black immigrants, a fact which the statistics clearly bear out. And you can see here that throughout the 1920s, deportations, Black immigrants were a much higher proportion of total deportees than they were of total immigrants into the country. So to go back to some of these prominent figures, for instance, over the course of 1932, numerous articles focused on the case of quote-unquote Kid Chocolate, a world featherweight champion boxer who was deported to Cuba after being charged with criminal behavior by the family of his 17-year-old fiancée. Kid Chocolate, whose real name was Eligio Sardinas, but also went by the name Cuban Bonbon, attempted to re-enter the country again a year later for a fight at Madison Square Garden, at which point he was offered the aid of the NAACP in securing entry to the country, providing the excuse of the Labor Department in barring him was based on color. Another famous boxer, Louis Fall, aka the Battling Sigi, a native of Senegal and a world light heavyweight champion, was deported in 1924. In 1937, and this is just yet another case, in 1937, the famous manager and owner of multiple Negro League baseball teams, Alex Pompez, was threatened with deportation but managed to win a temporary stay in his case. In 1939, Luis Rafael Corbin, a professional golfer and the private golf tutor to Joe Louis himself, was deported to Bermuda on the basis of overstaying his visa, in spite of protests. In other cases, it was actors and entertainers whose presence in the country was policed by immigration officials. Frank Watson, a native of British West Africa who had been charged with illegal entry, was deported in 1936. The coverage reported that he had been in the country for nearly 20 years and had served in a variety of organizations, as well as in an African group of the Federal Theater before his removal. In a rare 1932 case where deportation was successfully fought, Charles Sager, the longtime agent for the famous vaudeville team of Williams and Walker, who had moved to Canada for some time, was detained and threatened with deportation back to Canada after his re-entry. When the immigration inspector at the border asked him about his papers, he allegedly responded, "Can't you see the map of Alabama on my face? I'm going home to where I was born." Although immigration officials tried to claim he was a Canadian subject by naturalization, he acquired a lawyer, and the Commissioner General of Immigration eventually settled the case in his favor. In still other cases, including that of the most famous black deportee of the era, Marcus Garvey, it was political activism that the African American press identified as the cause of his removal. But he wasn't the only one. When men such as Charles Romney, who was deported to Trinidad in 1938 on a charge of illegal entry, was deported, the black press was quick to note that it had more to do with the fact that he was, quote unquote, well known as one of the loudest and most virulent of Harlem's soapbox orators. Romney himself was reported to protest that his deportation was due to his politics and that he was removed precisely because of, quote, his strength as a mob raiser. There cannot be much doubt that the African American press generally saw the 1927 deportation of Marcus Garvey as a reaction of the white state to the power and wide appeal of his activism. Unlike the mainstream press, which focused primarily on the government's assertions of his legal improprieties, the African American press, even when it was highly critical of Garvey, or in some cases actively advocated for his removal, remained focused on the clear political stakes of his removal. It is important to think seriously about Garvey's deportation not only as a notable or exceptional case, but also as an indication of the US government's efforts to squash black dissent through any means available, including, increasingly, through the use of immigration law. The removal of the leader of a massively popular movement for racial liberation did more than just reflect anti-immigrant sentiment. It showed that immigration control could be used to strike at black activism itself. Beyond the coverage of black Americans deported from the US, the black press also focused a great deal of attention on the cases of African Americans who were deported or expelled from countries around the world. In 1929, a Chicago Defender article entitled "Australia Enforces Color Line Bar, Efforts Made to Prohibit Alien Races," traced the racial immigration policy of the Australian government. Quote, "White Australia is a rallying cry behind a widespread movement," the article reported, aimed at barring African Americans and Italians from the Commonwealth. One of its most concrete expressions, it explained, had been in the deportation of the African American jazz band known as Sonny Clay's Plantation Orchestra. The former premier, William Hughes, who was alleged to be behind the movement, was quoted as having said, "This bit of earth belongs to us. It is for us to say how many should come in." Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the press continued to report on repeated incidents in which African American musicians were deported from countries around the world, including a number of cases in both England and Germany where black musicians were deported. One of the most heavily covered cases of an African American deportation, in this case successfully prevented, was the 1922 case of Matthew Bullock. Bullock had fled to Canada after racial hostilities in his native North Carolina had led to the lynching of his brother and another man by a local mob. Bullock, who entered Canada without authorization, was charged by the local police with instigating a race riot, and after he was investigated for deportation, fought his case on the basis that he would be murdered if he were to return. The NAACP took on his case, and Walter White himself went to Canada to work on his deportation defense. The appeal to stay his deportation was in fact successful, and while the black press celebrated that fact, they also remarked on the sad light it cast on the plight of race relations in the United States. Among the most appalling cases to African American observers was the expulsion of Langston Hughes from Mexico in 1926. The Mexican government, quote, "regards Mexican soil as too sacred for Negro feet to tread," one article stated, explaining that there had also been threats to deport a large number of African American laborers living in Mexico. Hughes had first been denied entry when attempting to travel to Mexico, then let in on a limited visa. After he overstayed the visa, the government threatened to kick him out, leading to an international negotiation over the rights of black Americans to travel freely in Mexico. As a result of his case, a ruling was passed declaring that African Americans would be permitted the same entry privileges as all other American citizens. Several years later, Hughes again was in the spotlight after he was expelled from Japan in 1933 on accusations of, quote, aiding the Red Movement in Japan, and being denied the right to see the US consulate there. One article explained that he had been detained, searched, questioned at length, and accused on the basis of his recent trips to Moscow and Shanghai as having sought to incite red troubles in Japan. Additionally, African American observers were particularly fascinated by certain cases in which white racists were actually deported back to the US for their actions. In the most famous case, two American men, Lemuel Lewis of Detroit and William Brown of Toledo, were deported from the Soviet Union in 1930 after a highly publicized case in which they were found guilty of assaulting a black American man named Robert Robinson in the mess hall at the tractor plant in Stalingrad where they all worked. The black press was particularly focused on this case and reported that, quote, "The Soviet gave race-hating white Americans their first lesson in justice today when it ordered the deportation. The accused were found to be dangerous, menacing citizens to have in the country because they were imbued with the spirit of race prejudice." In 1926, headlines declared Germany to deport alleged Klansmen and explained that a German-born American citizen named Gotthard Strohschein had been charged with trying to organize a chapter of the Knights of the Fiery Cross and was to be removed to the United States for his action. In 1930, another headline declared Canada opens war on Klan to oust hooded mob, and explained that the Canadian government intended to crack down on local Klan leaders. One such deportee, J.H. Hawkins of Newport, Virginia, had immigrated and attempted to start a rival KKK organization in Hamilton, Ontario, before his deportation. Perhaps one of the most obvious and striking ways in which the African American press coverage of deportation differed from that of the mainstream press was in its global outlook on the phenomena. The African American press during these decades carried extensive coverage of stories of deportation around the world, particularly when it seemed that the forced out migration was being used as a clear way of enforcing racial exclusivity in nations around the world. The deportations of African Americans from various nations throughout the world were treated as a clear indication of global racial regimes, while the mainstream press covered these stories only occasionally. There was a particular interest in the way that the emergence of a global deportation regime served the interests of settler colonial states around the world, including Australia and South Africa, as well as the United States. An examination of the black press, therefore, emerges as a critical angle for understanding not only the black reaction to immigration, but also to developing a more multi-directional understanding of the global migration control regimes of the early 20th century. While the mainstream press focused almost exclusively on deportations from the United States, thus reifying the narrative that the US has been the sole and all-powerful arbiter of immigration control, the African American press reveals a different story. In the traditional narrative, the US is always the destination and desired outcome, and any violations of immigration must therefore naturally be in the interests of a desperate quest to reach and remain in the so-called promised land. Accounts of deportations to the US, alongside discussions of parallel border enforcement policies around the world, in fact call into question many of the most dearly held myths about the exclusivity of the American nation. The black press undermined that narrative and can be useful in combating some of the most warped yet pervasive elements of immigration history as a field. Alongside critiques of deportations of black immigrants and attention to the deportation of black Americans from around the world, the black press also featured numerous stories around the ways in which deportation of non-black immigrants from the United States was used to enforce the color line. Such writers revealed the multifaceted ways in which deportation came to be seen as an effective tool for policing white and other immigrants who showed support for African Americans or who crossed the established racial boundaries in American society, therefore ensuring that future immigrants would understand the message, either participate in the structures of racial segregation or risk expulsion. One of the most common ways that the African American press created those narratives was through frequent stories about immigrants who came to the attention of the immigration authorities because they engaged in interracial marriages or sexual relationships. One 1939 article in the Baltimore Afro-American entitled "Deportation Hits Mixed Families" discussed the case of two interracial families in Rhode Island who were each facing deportation. In one case, the mother, a white French-Canadian woman married to an African-American man, was threatened with deportation, while in the other, a black Portuguese man married to a white woman faced the same threat. One woman was reported to have said that, quote, "the interracial angle was what inspired the deportation proceedings," while the other agreed, and she noted that her case had come to the attention of the authorities only when she was in the hospital maternity ward and local officers were startled to discover the race of her husband. In another instance, deportation was used as a strategy to punish the transgression of passing. Alma Street had arrived in the US from Jamaica, engaged to a white man who believed her to be white. After discovering that she was not, he refused to marry her, although they had, quote unquote, already lived as man and wife, and her case was brought to the deportation authorities, who began the process of her removal. Other stories relied on the plight of interracial children from homes destroyed by deportation to stress the impact of the immigration regime. In 1939, the Cleveland Gazette covered the case of an interracial married couple in which the husband was slated for deportation to Italy, but the wife was a Black Canadian citizen who officials were also attempting to deport. The couple had American-born children, leaving immigration officials in a quandary about what to do with the family. In another highly publicized case, young Earl Hing, age 6, garnered considerable attention after he wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt asking her to intervene in defense of his father. Hing, the son of a Chinese immigrant father and an African-American mother, was depicted as a highly sympathetic character in the face of his father's removal, although the press coverage did in fact racialize his Chinese father heavily. The other major way that African Americans came to understand deportation as a facet of anti-Black government repression was through the frequent accounts about individuals who were deported because of their support of African Americans. The 1930 case of Stephen Graham, an Austrian communist who was deported after, quote, addressing a race group in the so-called Black Belt, gained a fair amount of attention and was actually quite representative for the period. Graham, numerous articles explain, had been recommended for deportation precisely because he had held a meeting for 150 African Americans and a number of white workers in Virginia. He was initially charged and arrested with, quote, inciting the Negro population to insurrection against the white population, and then rearrested later for, quote, advocating the violent overthrow of the government. And he was entered into deportation proceedings. Similarly, the 1935 case of Karl Ohm's deportation to Germany was explained as being a case of him being deemed, quote, a race sympathizer who dared participate in the fight for race rights. Ohm, the press insisted, was in a particularly precarious situation because he would undoubtedly face persecution and quite possibly death under Hitler's regime. Few cases caught the attention of the African-American press more thoroughly than that of Japanese citizen Satohata Takahashi, who was deported twice from Detroit over the course of the 1930s. Takahashi, a quote-unquote agitator who had organized the Society for the Development of Our Own, an organization which fought for, quote, a doctrine of goodwill and uplift of the dark race, moved to Detroit in 1933 and quickly gathered large audiences in Black neighborhoods. Reports from the Black press note that before being branded by the police as a racketeer, Takahashi had been known as an effective and charismatic speaker and had gathered as many as 10,000 members. Headlines like, quote, nab Jap who preached anti-Nordic creed, federal authorities hold suspect in Detroit for deportation, circulated widely in the Black press, which also noted frequently that he had married an African-American woman while living in Toledo. In 1934, he was charged with, quote, attempting to organize a subversive movement among colored people and deported, but he re-entered the country from Canada several years later on a false passport. After resuming his work in Detroit, he was once more arrested and deported in 1939. And perhaps the most poignant article on the functioning of the early deportation regime, William Jones wrote in a 1927 article explaining that the system had far overreached its purposes and was now being used not to cure social ills, but to remove those who sought to alleviate them. In fact, he remarked, quote, 1927 finds Christianity in one of the most civilized countries on the globe in a mess of hypocrisy and wide of the mark which Jesus of Nazareth set. The fact is, if the real Jesus Christ should come back to the earth this Christmas with his philosophy, his idealism, and his burning earnestness, he would not only find surprises, but he would be deported, along with Garvey and some of the Russian Reds. While African-American positions on immigration remained generally supportive of restriction of some form or another throughout much of the early and mid-20th century, by the final decades of the century, their position had shifted significantly. This was particularly true among Black political leaders who increasingly began to discuss immigration as an issue of humanitarianism, particularly around refugee admissions. During the 1970s, despite continued concerns about economic competition, most Black leaders supported refugee admissions from Southeast Asia and urged more liberal immigration policies. During the course of the 1980s and 1990s, the Congressional Black Caucus generally voted alongside the Hispanic Caucus for liberalized immigration law and strengthened provisions for amnesty. And one of the major topics that they took up was the disproportionate and unequal treatment of Haitian refugees under American asylum law. More recently, Black activists have once again taken up the question of immigration and have increasingly come out against deportation as a form of racialized oppression and state policing, particularly in terms of its impact on Black immigrants. Just last Monday, the Atlanta Black Star published an article entitled "Deportation of Africans and Other Black Immigrants is quietly increasing and no one is taking note." The article explained increased deportations were particularly concentrated in terms of criminal convictions, which resulted from the over-policing of Black residents. It also explained that the bans attempted by the Trump administration, which include 3 African nations, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, will disproportionately impact Black immigrants, and in particular, Black Muslim immigrants. This article is in line with a growing amount of attention about how deportation has functioned as a form of anti-Blackness and only continues to grow in that power. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which operates as a coalition of both foreign-born and native-born Black Americans, has been at the forefront of pushing the narrative to include Black immigrants. Tia Oso, the national organizer for that group, has stated that, quote, "The roots of the anti-immigration movement are directly rooted to white nationalism and are related to maintaining the white power structure in narrowly defining who is American and is free to live in the country." Oso and others have called on African Americans to be aware of how the increased surveillance that the deportation state has brought will continue to be weaponized against Black people, regardless of their citizenship status. In 2006, the Movement for Black Lives included for the first time on its comprehensive platform a plank regarding immigration control and deportation. It called for, quote, "an end to the war on Black immigrants, including a repeal of the 1996 crime and immigration bills, an end to all deportations, immigration detention, and immigration and customs enforcement raids, and mandated legal representation in immigration court." One leader, Carl Lipscomb, who's also active in the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, stated of the decision, quote, "When you think about deportations and immigrants in detention, it's really under the banner of mass criminalization." These groups have decried the remarkable lack of coverage about Black immigrants in the news and have sought to create an awareness of the disproportionate impact the modern deportation system has had not only on immigrants of color generally, but on Black immigrants specifically. Other groups address the continuation of anti-Blackness within the mainstream immigrant rights movement, such as Jonathan Jays Green, an Afro-Latino co-founder of the Undocu-Black Network, explained in a recent interview, there's work to be done to quote-unquote Blackify the narrative about undocumented immigration. In the face of these current discourses, it seems particularly important to push back against the persistent erasure of Blackness from historical accounts of immigration, as well as from our understanding of the roots of our modern system of immigration control. Thank you.